Well, that was the Bushmills Pipers, everyone. They were amazing. Now, to introduce the real main event, Steve Beal, Senior Master of Whisky, Keeper of the Quake.
Thank you, Allison. Just really, it's a real pleasure to be here with you tonight. I travel with my own army, the Bushmills Pipers, and they always come wherever I go, so it's part of the deal. So I hope you enjoyed them. When you go downstairs, please enjoy a little of their wonderful single malts that they brought along. Some beautiful port cask and Madeira cask and sherry cask finished single malts, and the wonderful 1608 that celebrates the 400th anniversary of the Bushmills Distillery. So they'll be down there, and the band will perform a couple other times during the evening, so you have a chance to enjoy them. I'm Steve Beal, Senior Master of Whisky for Diageo Spirits North America. I look after the whiskey portfolio. I'm Scottish, come from Scotland, and it really pains me to tell you the Irish did invent whiskey. But you got to remember that goes back to the days when the Irish and the Scots were in fact the same tribe. In fact, it was an Irish tribe named the Scots who invaded Scotland and gave it its name as well as its whiskey. So when I complain that the Irish invented whiskey, I even complain twice as loud when I tell you the Irish invented Scotland. Anyway, we're here to talk a little bit about the regions of Scotland. So just imagine a map of Scotland. And we're going to take you on a little bit of a tour tonight, a tasting tour, but a very, very special one because the whiskeys that we are tasting tonight have some very special characteristics. They are limited edition vintage single malts. Each one of them has been made in the traditional single malt manner, but then aged in two kinds of casks. They've been hand-selected in batches of 300 each, 300 barrels each, and then bottled. Well, before they're bottled, they've been moved to the actual casks that have been used to make vintage dessert wines. Sherry, port, different kinds of sherry, in fact. And one of these is a very, very special one tonight because it just won at the World Spirits competition, one of the directors of which is sitting right here, Dottie. Just won at the World Spirits competition here in San Francisco the sweepstakes prize for the best single malt in the world. So we'll get that. We'll save that kind of toward the end. So first of all, how many of you have been to a master class, a whiskey class before? Okay, anybody been to mine? Any alumni of Steve? Good, one or two. So you can help us. Okay. So one of the things that we want to sort of talk about is a little bit about the history of making whiskey. I joked a little bit about the Irish, but it really begins a little before that. Monks, probably living in the western part of France, Tyrannensian monks they were called, kind of Benedictines, moved to Ireland and Scotland to spread their faith. And it's a little bit difficult with the cigar smokers. I don't know what it is that cigars do to people. So bear with me. These monks moved to Ireland and Scotland and England and Wales to spread the faith. And one of the things monks did, in those days, there were no Motel 6s to leave the light on for you. There weren't actually any bars. There were no hotels. There were no restaurants. There were probably no people as well, or very few. But if you were traveling and you needed a place to stay, you needed a warm bed of straw shared by several people, I think. You needed a nice meal, a little something to drink to keep you going. Maybe if you weren't feeling well, maybe if you're sick and you needed some medicine, you would stop by the public house of the local monastery. These were placed about a day's journey apart. And while most of the monks lived in quiet and worked and prayed, Some of them were responsible for taking care of travelers and taking care of the hungry and taking care of the poor. And in doing that, they made you a bowl of soup, they made you a little bit of beer, they made you a little bit of medicine. But to make their medicines, they needed first to make alcohol, which they called the aqua vitae, the water of life. And it's that alcohol to which they added herbs and spices and honey. Those were called liqueurs. Or they added various kinds of minerals, iodine, for example. And anybody know what that would be called? A tincture. So our monks were making medicine with the water of life. And they made the alcohol simple ways. In the mainland, they made the alcohol from grapes. But if any of you visited Scotland and Ireland, how many of you have ever been there? Good, most of you. Good. You realize that it's like this. This is a really good summer day, or the barley that makes Scotch differ from neighborhood to neighborhood. What makes a distinct regional style comes from the fact that whiskey makers, up until very, very recently, didn't travel very far. I have a friend who runs the Colilla distillery on the Isle of Islay. And he was born in the manager's house when his grandfather was manager of that distillery. And when he came here to San Francisco to visit, our company put him up in a really nice hotel, and we took him to the finest restaurants. And he called me in the middle of the night and said, "Stephen, can you get me some fish and chips?" They asked him, Billy, will you be wearing a kilt? He didn't own a kilt. And, well, okay, you can wear a suit. I don't own a suit. Well, okay, just wear a tie. I don't have a tie. He'd lived on the island of Islay his entire life and only gotten off of it 6 times. In the old days, distillers very seldom went more than about 5 or 10 miles from where they lived. And they knew the managers of other distilleries. They knew the other farmers. More than likely, a distillery manager would be married to the sister of another distillery manager who probably knew what her brother was doing in secret to make his whiskey delicious. Sometimes, of course, those whiskeys were made by women. The Cardew distillery, very famous for the fact that Elizabeth Cumming ran the place for 50 years. Now, Cardew, you can taste it downstairs, is a wonderful 12-year-old Speyside whiskey, the heart of every Johnny Walker. A beautiful, really delicious whiskey. But whiskeys developed their flavors along the lines of who knew who, or who knew whom in the local neighborhood. So the folks out in the islands who never came to the mainland developed a very strongly peaty style. Now, somewhere on your table, there's a hunk of peat. This is cut from a bog. This could be 100,000 years old. In this are roots and leaves and branches, heather, oak leaves, pine needles, a little seaweed sometimes when the tsunamis hit. Maybe over 100,000 years. It develops about an inch every 100 years or so. We dig this up, we dry it out, and we burn it. And in Scotland, you use this to heat your house. You can use it to cook your food. In the old days, it was the principal source of fuel. And out in the islands of Scotland, it's the only source of fuel. So when they're making their barley, drying it out, boiling their stills, they're using burning peat. And when this stuff burns, it really, really, really smells. In fact, it smells very good, but you speak Scottish because you already use the word that describes what burning peat smells like. When you say something reeks, you're using one of the most common Scottish words used. But I bet you didn't think it had to do with whiskey. So you pick up this glass, pick up the one on the very end, just to smell. The farthest to your right. Okay? Pick that up and smell it. You smell the smoke? Smell the smoke in that? Would you ever say this whiskey reeks? No, not at all. This, by the way, is considered to be the best single malt in the world. But it does smell of burnt peat. Well, out in the islands, they developed that sense of smokiness that became very much part of their life and their whiskeys. Back on the mainland, down in Glasgow, where they make Auchentoshan, or over across on the Edinburgh side, where my family come from, where they make Glenkinchie, the lowland whiskies are made in great big giant pot stills that impart a very light, grassy sort of flavor. And they use very little peat in making whiskey in the lowlands. In fact, I would say probably none. Or if any, a tiny, tiny bit. So I want you to pick up the one on the other end, which is a Glenkinchie Distiller's Edition. Glenkinchie Distiller's Edition is a lovely Glenkinchie. Spent 12 years in a bourbon cask. Then it was moved to a beautiful sherry cask, a Amontillado sherry cask, a vintage Amontillado sherry cask. You can smell the lovely softness and the grassiness and lemon, maybe a little quince, which is a good thing because the word Glenkinchie means Valley of the Quince Trees. It's also the scene of a very famous opera, Lucia del Lammermoor, a wonderful opera about a wonderful Scottish princess by Donizetti. And it takes place in the hills right around the Glenkinchie distillery, where the water for Glenkinchie comes from. And so Glenkinchie reflects that geography, it reflects the style, it reflects the lowland mentality. It also reflects the fact that the distillery is about 100 years old, and it was always a legal distiller. The British let them make it there. They paid the tax. Because of that, they were allowed to use bigger stills, and the bigger copper pots make this lovely, soft, beautiful, easy-to-drink whiskey. Big difference between the islands and the lowlands of Scotland. Now, Islay, which is where the first whiskey we know comes from, is famous for its whiskey. 7, 8, 9, 10 distilleries. Everybody's trying to build another one there. Beautiful whiskeys, famous ones like Lagavulin, Laphroaig, Ardbeg, all of your favorite. How many of you like those smoky ones? You are the peat heads, okay? Or peatniks. All your favorites from that island. They developed their style in the other regions of Scotland as well. Now, somewhere in the middle of the country, we'll go to the second whiskey from your left. The Dalwhinnie is the highlands of Scotland. And Dalwhinnie is the highest of the highlands. It's 1,000 feet above sea level plus. Coldest place in Scotland. I think the coldest record for the coldest temperature, which is probably any day of the year from my recollection as a kid. Cold, high, takes an extra couple of years for it to mature. This one is about 17 or 18 years in its final making. Starts out 15 years in a bourbon cask, and then it moves into an Oloroso sherry cask for anywhere from a few months to a couple of years for it to get ready for you. Soft, delicious, but with an unusual complexity that famous Highland whiskies are noted for. But they're also usually fairly gentle, fairly easy to drink, and some people call this the gentle spirit. Now, somewhere between those highlands and the islands, we have the coast of Scotland. And right in the middle, you have an Oban. Some people say Oban, some people say Oben, some people say Oban, but it's Oban. That's how the people who live there say it. And this Oban is the traditional 14-year-old Oban that a lot of you know and love, but it's been moved into a Montilla Fino sherry cask after its first 14 years. Now, on our scale of peatiness, if we're talking about smoke, we'll start with Glenkinchie and we'll call that 0. And we'll go to the one on the other end, or the two on the other end, the Talisker and the one on the end, and we'll call that a 10. And it wouldn't surprise you that Oban, which is made on the coast, halfway between the two, has halfway between the two in smokiness. We'd probably give that a 5. I want you to think of Oban as perfect whiskey for a bay cruise. Oban, think of foghorns. Oban. Soft and low, a little bit of smoky. Or if you're one of those people who's into the symphony, think of oboe. And it's no surprise that being right in the middle of everything like that, flavor-wise, that it's one of the world's most favorite single malts. Problem is, the distillery is a tiny little distillery. If you take a whiskey like a Macallan or a Glenlivet, 25 or 30 stills, I think, these days. Oban, you know how many they have? Two stills. They work 6 days a week, and when they've made their whiskey, they've made it. That's all there is. They can't make the distillery bigger because it was the first thing built in the town, and it's surrounded by historic buildings almost 360 degrees, and in back of it, there's an archaeological site where they found some of the first human remains in the British Isles. So you know they're not going to build another distillery in the back, and probably not in the front as well. If you ever go to Oban, by the way, it's right down on the dock practically, and if you come out of the distillery, you'll see a Chinese restaurant, very nice, right across the street. Make a right, there's Nori's Fish and Chips, and I always get free fish and chips when I go there because all you guys go there and try it. Nori's Fish and Chips is the best fish and chips in the entire British Isles. Just maybe in the world. So go there. So anyway, Oban is in a wonderful place to visit. In fact, all these distilleries are wonderful places to visit. And if you go to visitingdistilleries.com, you can actually find out how to visit them and when they're open and how to get there. So lovely opportunity to think about your plans for the summer. So now we're going to taste some whiskey. So I want you to take the one called Crag and Moore, which is going to be the third one in from your right. Crag and Moore is a Speyside whiskey, like many of your favorites. Soft and sweet. But to taste whiskey, we're going to follow my method that I've borrowed from dozens of other whiskey makers. First, you want to taste with the eye. And I always remember the grace I learned as a child from the Psalms, taste and see that the Lord is good. Okay? Look at it with the eye. Because what the color you're seeing here is an unadulterated Oban whiskey, Craig and Moore whiskey, that's been aged for the first 12 years in a bourbon cask and then moved to where it acquires just a hint of the violet color from the port and a bit of the fruitiness from the wood. The same fruitiness in that wood that gave that vintage port its beautiful flavor now gives this beautiful whiskey, which is gorgeous on its own, a little special touch. Next thing, taste with the nose. And if we can get past the cigars, we'll be fine. Wine glasses are perfect for this, as a lot of you know. Don't stick your nose all the way in as you get the alcohol. Just kind of close up, get personal. Give it a little Eskimo kiss, okay? Have a sniff of it. Find the fruit. Maybe a little bit of banana and coconut coming from the bourbon cask. A little bit of rich fruit coming from the port cask. And beautiful, soft whiskey. Tiny little touch of peat. Then have a sip. For a sip of whiskey, a little burn to the tongue. That's okay. Got to get your mouth ready. And then if you want to, now I always suggest you add a drop of water. At the World Spirits Competition, the judges take a capful of this kind of water, beautiful clear water. You can ask me what kind of water should I use. There are several I recommend, but you definitely, except in San Francisco where the tap water is very nice, you probably don't want to use tap water. And when you add a couple of drops of water, and it could be one drop, could be half a dozen of them. What you're doing now is you're going to release aldehydes, one of the distillates that create a sense of sweetness, and esters, which cause aromas. And you're going to release them. My good friend Robin Cooper, who works for the Glenrothes and a couple of other distilleries, Bowmore, are wonderful places. Robin always calls this releasing the serpent. I'm afraid of snakes, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that means, but you can see the threads and eddies in the glass as the water begins to mix around with the whiskey. And then when you taste it your second time, you're going to find a more developed aroma and a more developed sweetness in taste. So you get the heart of the Speyside married with a wonderful little tint of port. How many of you like this one? That's pretty nice whiskey, isn't it? Pretty nice whiskey. Very soft and beautiful. Again, did people in the old days age this whiskey in more than one cask? My grandfather, who was a distiller all of his life, said yes. This is sort of a new thing to the whiskey world, this secondary casking, as we call it, or double maturation. At the same time, in the old days, barrels were hard to come by, and as they emptied one, they'd put it into another and combine whiskeys. They did a lot of things in the old days, and the distillery managers, the distillery owners, always kept the best for themselves, kind of in the back in a stash. And this distiller's edition kind of mimics that idea, because they're made in small batches, and they're all vintage dated, and they're all in limited release. Everybody with me so far? So we have regions all over Scotland: Lowlands, Highlands, the coastal. We have Islay. We have another island, for example, Talisker, which in our company gets its own special region all by itself. Talisker is the Isle of Skye. And if you go to the Isle of Skye, you'll see the sun every once in a while, maybe a decade or two. It rains there a lot. The Cullen Mountains are kind of sharp and rise from the sea right to the sky. And Talisker is made right on the water. In fact, one time the distillery caught fire and all the whiskey flowed out into the bay, and there was this big blue flame everywhere. That was apparently quite a sight. That's probably in the 1960s. I can remember visiting Talisker with my grandfather. He had a friend who worked there, and first thing we did when we got there was get oysters. The guys who work at the distillery raised them, but they got the oysters right out of the bay, opened them up with a Swiss Army knife, and poured a little Talisker on top of it. And I've eaten oysters that way ever since, and really, really love it. This Talisker, though, it has the usual spicy finish of a Talisker, a little chipotle chili. Bites you on the tip of the tongue, goes away for a while, and explodes in the back of your mouth. Hand grenades. Talisker is a big, big flavor. A lot of peat and a lot of spiciness. But this one is aged in a loving sherry cask, Amoroso. A very heavy, very powerful, raisiny sherry. And so you'll find this really almost barbecue kind of quality to the flavor of this one. Unquestionably Talisker, but also unquestionably nice. It's kind of the well-behaved member of the Talisker family. None of the rest of them are. They're bullies. They love you. They like to fight. Very, very strong, beautiful whiskeys. And the favorite of lots of peat heads. So let's go now back over to Glenkinchie. A lot of people say you should taste whiskeys starting with the lightest, moving to the biggest. I don't necessarily subscribe to that unless you're brand new to the idea. So go back to the Glenkinchie, try the same thing, and I want you to look for the lemoniness, the sweetness of it, Amontillado sherry. Nice, beautiful sweet nose. Last night for dinner, I had bread pudding with a caramel sauce that was made by my host using Glenkinchie Distiller's Edition. Fairly expensive sauce, I have to admit, but it was absolutely delicious. And she had put some golden raisins into the bread pudding that she had soaked in the Glenkinchie whiskey. And of course, there is a very definite sultana or golden raisin flavor that you find in the Glenkinchie Distillers Edition. Very beautiful and soft. As well as that grassy lemoniness that you find in it as well. Everybody with me so far? So, next to the Dalwhinnie, we've sniffed the Dalwhinnie before. I want you to now taste what I think is one of the most sublime single malts from the Highlands. So everybody do the little ritual. Now, how should you drink your whiskey? Should you add water? A lot of people say, oh no, I want it neat. Other people say, always add water. I'm going to say what my grandfather says, drink it any way you like it, okay? As to adding ice, his favorite saying is, Stephen, we don't make ice in Scotland on purpose. And if you go to a McDonald's, this has happened to me at the airport in Glasgow, get a Coca-Cola. They won't give you ice in it unless you ask. So we don't put ice in anything in Scotland on purpose, except for Americans. But then, if you lived in Scotland, you'd understand that. Now, here, except today, you might not put ice either, but Americans like to add ice, and I'd say, if it floats your boat, do it. Because it's you who are drinking it, not me. And I could be very snobby and suggest you need to do everything the way I like it. My grandfather's favorite saying was, there's one way to do it. That's the right way, and that's my way. And so, but my way to drink whiskey, I tend to add just a drop or two of water. But if you want to add an ice cube, please feel free. So what did you think of Dalwhinnie? Dalwhinnie means the meeting place. So who was meeting there? A bunch of cattle thieves and illegal whiskey makers. And they were trading my beef for your whiskey. And that's how the whiskey trade developed in the early days. People from up in the north, where the British couldn't get to, made whiskey, brought it down in firkins, small casks, and traded it for trade goods. And they met near what is the modern distillery of Dalwhinnie, which if you take the road from the south and go up to Inverness, it's right up in the pass, right at the top, in the middle of no place. And one of the most beautiful, pristine places. And if you've ever been there, been by it. I just definitely recommend that you take the time to stop off and see it. You'll think of it as a little Chinese temple off in the distance because it's got the wonderful pagodas from the malting buildings. They're still in place. And you see this odd oriental sight as you're driving past it. But you go there, they'll treat you very, very well. Lovely, soft, gentle whiskey. Go back to the Oban now for a second, because this is one of my favorites. This is the Oban Distillers Edition Montilla Fino cask. Probably 1993, I would guess. Actually, it's the 1995 vintage. The new one that's recently released to us. So pick that up and find the nice balance between the softness of the coastal Highland malt Oban added to the deliciousness of that nice sherry. Now, Fino sherries are noted for the fact that they often have a secondary fermentation. A cloud of yeast forms in the cask. And so Fino sherries have a yeastiness like really good champagne. And you'll find the yeastiness kind of comes through in the flavor of the Oban. We've tasted the Cragganmore and we've tasted the Talisker. Now we're going to go to the end to what I think is the piece de la résistance, as the French would say. And this is not Lagavulin. I know that on your map it says Lagavulin Distillers Edition. But because this whiskey won the best single malt in the world a week ago, we thought we'd include it as our Islay version whiskey for this evening. And this is the Colilla. And Colilla is a very interesting place. The tidal flow between the island of Islay and Jura is very, very fast. And there's a place out there called the Corryvreckan, which is a kind of a whirlpool that'll suck your boat down. And the animals, the deer that go from island to island, swim upstream in order to coast to get back to the other side as the tide changes. And the whiskey is made right on the water, one of the most beautiful views. And this whiskey picks up the flavor of the ocean, the salt air that Isla and island whiskeys have become famous for. If you're a Lafroig drinker, you might find that Colila is a wonderful alternative. Lafroig's a wonderful whiskey, and I'll drink it myself if someone else is buying it for me. But you'll find that Colila is a wonderful, soft, sweet, but briny, musky Isla whiskey. But this Colila spent 12 years in the traditional bourbon barrel and then went into a muscat cask, a Muscat Amabile or Moscato Bianco, sometimes called Muscatel. And that wonderful lemony sweet grape complements the nice smoky palate of the Colila. Yes? Oh, very, very little, really. Very, very little. Lagavulin uses some European oak, but most of the peaty scotches are aged in bourbon casks. And that would be true of most single malts, actually. I would say about 95, 96% of single malts aged in what do we call second fill bourbon barrels. That is, we use them for the second time when they get to Scotland, and we make single malts. Yes, sir. This is the 12. This is the 12 extra aged another 6 to 18 months. Now, I have a question here about the parts per million on the peat, and I have to tell you that I represent 27 different single malts made by our company, and I don't carry all those statistics around in my head. But if you want to get my business card downstairs, I've got them on the table down there, I'll be very happy to answer that question for you in the future. The funny thing about peat is it's often measured in parts per million, and you take that measurement from the grain when the malt is being smoked, if you will. We sprout the barley first, then we dry it with a peat fire. And we can take that parts per million measurement at the malt house, or we can take the parts per million measurement when we brew that malt into a beer, or we can take the parts per million measurement after it's distilled twice and put in the cask, and then we can take that measurement again later on when we're ready to bottle it. And those measurements often vary. It only takes a little bit of peat to give something a very peaty flavor, because the nature of single malt is those things that give it flavor actually occur in parts per million. That's what we mean by ppms. So you want to find out that, I'll get that for you happily. This is the Distiller's Edition, which started out as the 12-year-old and then was moved to the Muscat cask. And I brought 3 extra bottles, and if they're not all gone when you get downstairs, you can have a little more if you like it, because it's sort of special whiskey to me. So anyway, any questions? Any more questions while we're doing it? Yes. When we say at Diageo Distiller's Edition, we mean that the distillers have taken 300 casks at a time and chosen them for extra maturation in a second cask. And each of our distilleries which does this chooses a special type of wine cask. They're not just generic sherry, but they're very special ones. So anyway, we're probably getting on to impinging on the next folks who are coming for the next class, but I want to make sure that if you've got some questions, you have time to ask. You're probably wondering what a keeper of the quake is. That I'm sort of embarrassed about this, but every year the Scotch whisky industry gets together at Blair Castle, where the quake of Scotland is kept. And the quake is the symbol of the Scotch whisky industry. And about 50 people from around the world are chosen to be keepers of the quake. And it's kind of a special honorary title. You're kind of considered to be a world ambassador not just for your own brands, but for the entire world, the entire Scotch whiskey industry. And I was very pleased to be made a keeper. They call it getting keepered. Some of you may know Dr. Bill Lumsden from Glenmorangie. He and I were in the same class together this last year. And there are 52 of us who received our keepering at Blair Castle, and that's a picture of it. It's one hell of a party, I'll tell you that. Responsible party, but one hell of a party. So I'm very honored to be in it. That's this little medal on the holy medal I have on my jacket. So happy to share more about that with you. You're supposed to leave them so I can use them again, but if you really got to have it, you can go ahead. There's a little booklet that has a lot of information there, and please feel free to take that, and I hope you enjoy our little gifts that we've handed out tonight. And we'll see you downstairs for a little more whiskey and a lot more fun. So thank you very much.